Good morning and welcome to the Bible Speaks. I am Rachel Brooks and I'm glad that you're here today with us. Once again, we're discussing how to read and interpret Scripture honestly and authentically. And our basic rule is that we cannot simply interpret Scripture by assigning whatever meaning we choose. Instead, we must try to determine what message the original author intended for us. We said there are 6 steps to follow when interpreting Scripture. Examine and understand genre. We need to look at the historical and cultural analysis. We need to do a contextual analysis. We need to do a lexical analysis. That's looking at individual words. And finally, we need to do a comparison and an application. Today, we'll be looking specifically at the idea of contextual analysis. Proof texting is the opposite of context. Proof texting is the method by which a person appeals to a biblical text to prove or justify a theological position without regard for the context of the passage they are citing. This is happening more and more in the modern church experience as the church becomes more politicized and more secularized. As well, churches tend to use the lectionary. And that can be dangerous because often passages are just lifted from the text and it is more difficult to really look at the continuity of the message. And so in my personal opinion, it is better to preach through books of the Bible if you have any worry about yourself or your congregation proof texting. Now, for those who truly understand how important context is and they truly want to understand Scripture, this method of proof texting really should be disparaged. Instead, we should be focusing on context, because a text without context is a pretext for a proof text. Context is important, and you know this from reading any sort of literature, any kind of scientific writings. Any communication must have context. Now, there are 6 questions we must ask in order to understand the context of a passage. First, we have to ask, what are the major blocks of literary material and how do they fit together as a literary whole? It is important as we look at a passage that we understand how it fits in with the rest of the chapter, how it fits in with the rest of the book, and how it fits in with the entire Bible. Second, we have to ask ourselves, how does the passage under consideration contribute to the flow of the author's argument or presentation of material? There is usually a logical and or a theological connection between any 2 adjacent passages. Third, we have to ask, what is the author's perspective? First of all, we need to say, when was this author writing? The easiest way to break things up is to say, is this an Old Testament writing or a New Testament writing? We also need to remember that we have to look at the situation in which the author is writing and what were they trying to accomplish through their writing. Authors write in narrative sections because they describe events from a human perspective, specifically theirs. But at other times, authors write as if they're looking through the eyes of God, or they're writing as a spokesperson for God. Depending on the perspective, the interpretation might be quite different. The fourth question we have to ask is, what constitutes the teaching focus of the passage and what represents incidental detail only? The fifth question, is the passage descriptive or prescriptive? A descriptive passage relates what was said or what happened at a particular time. A prescriptive passage gives us a normative principle to follow. As we're reading Scripture, we need to remember that what God says will always be true. What humans say may or may not be true. And what Satan or evil forces say, likewise, might be true or untrue. A caution we must follow is to be sure that if we claim through study we have found a prescriptive truth, that it must be affirmed by more than one point in Scripture. And we'll talk about this further. And finally, the last question we have to ask in order to determine context is who is being addressed in a particular passage. Is the author addressing national Israel, Old Testament believers, New Testament believers, or the world as a whole? Promises and commands are usually directed to one of the first three groups: national Israel, Old Testament believers, or New Testament believers. Normative promises and commands directed to New Testament believers are those most likely to apply to contemporary Christians. In other words, those will be the ones most likely to apply to us. So this concludes our brief discussion of context, but I want to remind you of our lessons as a whole. We are looking at how to properly interpret Scripture. We've already discussed examining and understanding genre. We've already discussed historical and cultural analysis. And today we looked at contextual analysis. And there were 6 questions that we said must be addressed in order to understand context. In future weeks, we'll look at word studies or lexical analysis, and comparison and application. So please join us again midweek and on Sunday morning. In our next presentation, I'll be giving a sermon where we will be looking at the contextual analysis of a particular passage in Genesis that is a difficult passage and is often skipped over by churches. We're going to be looking at Genesis 34, and I think that you'll find it to be an interesting message. So I hope to see you then. Thank you so much for being here today.